Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Every time I hear an introduction, I think I shouldn't say a word, I should just go home. Because it can't get better than that. So thank you. I'm going to start by telling you where my name came from and what it's not. My first name is really Sandra. And thank heavens for that, because my middle name is Bernonia, but she said, you know, if I name you Bernonia as your first name, people are going to call you Bruno as a kid. And that would have been hard for a little girl. So that's best. My grandfather came up with a name, and he went to Brown. And Brown in Latin is Bernonia. And he was a rabid alumnus of Brown. He wrote fight songs for their football team, and he wanted to be a writer, clearly. And he said, anyone who names their child Bernonia will get all of my money. That was good, huh? And so there was a little competition on. But I came the closest with Bernonia as my middle name, and he didn't leave us a cent, but he was a lot of fun. He did leave us a lovely summer house in Ossipee, New Hampshire, though. I shouldn't say not a cent, but a more fun place than that. So that's where the name comes from. And when I went to Italy on tour, everybody thought I was Italian, and then they saw the red hair, and they just couldn't figure out what I was. So but they were lovely. I am just finishing up my third book now, and I had an unusual route to publication. I'm going to give you a little bit of history, and then I'm going to go over the 3 books and then read from the third book that has not been submitted yet. So you'll be actually the second people to hear, and then anyone who watches will hear. But grew up in Marblehead, Mass. My father was a 7th generation Marbleheader. There's a lot of family pride in odd things, but so I was born in Salem Hospital, but he had my birth certificate changed to Marblehead, so I would be 8th generation. Very strange. But we were on Salem Harbor. There are 2 harbors in Marblehead, and we had a little beat-up Boston whaler that we kept at a mooring in Salem. And you know, before you could drive, you could certainly take the boat out, and there were no rules. So I would take it from Marblehead to Salem, and usually tie up at the House of Seven Gables. And they're kind of responsible in a very unusual way for my fiction career, so I'll tell you how that went. I would tie up there, and I would wander around the historic district of Salem, and I was absolutely intrigued. And then life went on. I got my license. I hung out mostly in Marblehead and forgot about Salem until we moved back. Left at 18, didn't come back, but just before I graduated from high school, I had a job for a few weeks as a tour guide at the House of Seven Gables. And it was a fill-in for someone who'd gone back to college early, and my mother got me the job. I was probably not employable at the time, but I was trying. And I had read the House of Seven Gables. I'd read The Scarlet Letter. I fancied myself quite an authority on Hawthorne. Not really, but what I hadn't read very well was the book that you had to read to be a tour guide. And so I spent the better part of 2 weeks as a tour guide. And one day, after the 4th tour of the day, I was leading a group down the back stairway from the secret room. I don't know if any of you have been to the House of Seven Gables, but they have a secret room that was created to depict what had been written about in the book. But everybody had different theories on what the secret room was. Well, I hadn't read enough in my tour guide book to know, so I had started making up my own stories about this. And as I came down the back staircase with about 10 people behind me, all very entertained by the stories, I think, they said, "Miss Berry, come with us." And they walked me to the front gate and basically to the whaler and sent me home. And I was fired. Cut to last year, or 2010, when the Map of True Places came out. They had, not knowing they had fired me from one job, they called me back down when the Lace Reader came out and said, "We'd like to help you with your books." And they put together a Lace Reader tour for tourists and book clubs coming through Salem. And then they offered me writing space when they heard that the Map of True Places was in part about Nathaniel Hawthorne. They offered me writing space at the House of Seven Gables. So I didn't tell them until this year that they had fired me. But this year they had a reunion for all their ex-tour guides, and I protested that I wasn't invited, and the whole story came out. But I think they were the first people that steered me toward fiction. You know, you shouldn't be trying to tell stories that are nonfiction because it doesn't suit you. Second group was the writers program at UNH, where I thought I would go into journalism. And after my first few articles and exercises in writing nonfiction, they pretty much said, Miss Berry, come here, we're going to send you over to the fiction department. So you can kind of see a pattern here. So I do make up stories, so you can't believe a thing I say, but that's the fun of it. I moved first to Chicago with to go on the national tour of Godspell and do their public relations. And in fact, I left school to do that and then came back in '76 to finish. And after that, I had a wonderful time in Chicago and you know, we worked for Second City and did all sorts of wonderful things out there. But after that, I thought, I'm going to New York City. I've got a great career in PR, and I'm sure New York wants me. I'm sure they're just dying to have me. So I went down to New York, and they basically said, go home. Miss Berry, go home. And so it didn't work out. But I had to get a job in New York, and I was living in an apartment in Queens at the time. And so I ended up getting a job at the World Trade Center the first year it was opened. And I was working for Toyota America on the 50th floor of the North Tower in their accounting department, which is about as far a cry from what I was trained to do as anything. But the good news was that I was the only one who passed the math test that particular day, and it was only addition and subtraction. So thank you, Marblehead school system, I guess. So what happened is they sent me to NYU at night to take accounting for the non-financial manager. And at the same time, or a little later in the evening, there was a screenwriting class. So I signed up for both. I went to my accounting class, and then I went to screenwriting. And I wrote my first screenplay. I was 26 and sold it to Hollywood. And I thought, well, and it was a 3-picture deal. And I thought, well, this is great. I'm going out to the West Coast. I'm on my way now. They're going to be dying to see me. You know what's coming, right? So I got to Hollywood and with my 3-picture deal, which was basically option money. And they basically said, Miss Berry, go home. I didn't, though. I met my husband out there, and we stayed for actually 15 years, all in all. And it was a great place to live, especially after Manhattan at the time, because Manhattan was very expensive. And Hollywood was relatively cheap. I lived in a building with 2 bedrooms and a pool, and it was $210 a month. So it was pretty great. And you know, no lease, could come and go as you want. Anyway, it was great, and we stayed for a long time. But every year we'd come back because my husband's from New York, New Jersey area, and my parents were still in Marblehead. And we'd come back for the summer and to go to the summer house that my grandfather had left. And we'd say, why are we not New England? We're really New England people. And then we'd come back for Christmas, and we'd freeze, and we'd go, maybe next year. So this went on for a very long time. Eventually, my dad called and said, if you're ever coming back, come now. I've been diagnosed with Parkinson's. And he'd been caregiver to my mom, who was in a wheelchair with rheumatoid arthritis. So he'd been taking care of her for years, and he suddenly needed help. And I think we were here within about a month and a half. And the first night back, I had a dream that gave me the first novel I'd ever written, which was The Lace Reader. And the dream went, well, I'll tell you, it's a little bit of a psychic dream, and so I'll tell you how it led into The Lace Reader. We had bought a house on Atlantic Ave in Marblehead, which is one of the main streets, and it was a 3-family house, but we decided we'd make it into a 1-family house. Not really a great idea for people who've lived in apartments forever to take on a project like that, but we thought we would. So we decided we'd knock down, it was old Victorian, we decided to knock down walls between the kitchen and a back room to make a larger kitchen. I think in hopes, I'm saying this and you have to verify that I would finally learn to cook. It was quite a bit of work, and they were supposed to have finished by the time we arrived and our movers came, but they hadn't, of course, because it's construction and it always takes a bit longer than you think it will. So I didn't unpack much, but what I did unpack was a little piece of bobbin lace, about the size of my hand, that my Irish grandmother had given me way back in high school. And the reason she gave it to me was that I was acting out a bit, and I was threatened with a school called St. Chrétien's, which was up on a hill. It's now part of Salem State. But it was where girls went to either become nuns or just never be seen again. And so I was always threatened with this. And someone would catch me at a party I wasn't supposed to be at or something, and my uncles would bring me home, and I'd hear this. So one Christmas, my grandmother had given me a piece of lace that the nuns at St. Chrétien's had made. They were known for making this lovely lace with a little note that said, "You too could learn to make lace." In other words, straighten up, kid. And so I did straighten up. And I didn't end up going to St. Chrétien's, but I always kept a little piece of lace. And so that first night back, I just unpacked the lace because it had always been on our bedside table. Every move, it had just gone with me. And, we unpacked the bedroom, went to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I had had a dream that I was looking through the little piece of lace at the wall they were about to knock out to make the bigger kitchen, and trying to see through the lace what my kitchen was going to look like when it was finished. And it seemed logical because it was a dream, but it's not. And I wondered what I had to eat that night. But I woke up very, very tense. And the reason was what I saw was not the granite countertops and the stainless steel appliances I wanted to see. It was a field of horses. First of all, this kitchen was on the second floor, and I don't think there's been a horse in Marblehead since the 50s, maybe. And so it was not a good dream. My heart was, pounding, and I finally went back to sleep. The next morning, the contractors came in to knock down the wall, and one of them, as they were putting their masks on, the dust masks on, and getting the, sledgehammers out, one of them happened to complain, "I hate this old horsehair plaster. It gets in the air and you can never get it out." And I am deathly allergic to horses, so we said, "No, stop." We stopped the whole project, and we eventually moved to Salem. But that was the beginning of the idea of the lace reader. And for me, every book starts with a question, and this question was, what if you could see your future in a piece of lace? And that's how it all started. And the other question that would follow would be, is that something you would want to do? So I want to talk just a little bit about questions that writers ask, because I talked about this in a class in the English department today. But I think the most important thing a writer of fiction can do, particularly, is pose a question, and then one question will lead to another until you have a full plot. But basically, until things develop, you ask questions for your characters. You ask a what-if question. Is usually how most stories start, is with an author saying, "What if this?" and then playing things through. What I don't think is the responsibility of the writer is to answer the big questions. I mean, there are some very big questions, hopefully, if you're writing a novel, that are going to come up, but I think it's the job of the reader to figure out the answer to that. I think you have to tie up all your plot lines, and I think you have to arc your characters, but I don't think you answer the big philosophical question necessarily. At least the books I like best don't. What they really do is start discussions between people and open people up to talking, I think. So I wanted to talk about questions in particularly, and talk about the books that I've been writing, and then I'll lead into the one that I'm working on now. For The Lace Reader, which was the first book, the question, what if you could see your future in a piece of lace? Would you want to know it? And out of that came a whole image system, which was lace itself, and what are the properties of lace, what can you see? And I started thinking about nature and lace, and there are so many patterns that are very reminiscent of lace within nature: trees, fur on pets, just all sorts of things that you see everywhere. And so a whole image system was created around this one piece of lace that came from my grandmother. That was the first book. And that was an odd route to publication, because my husband and I owned a software publishing company, which we had started when we moved back. And so rather than go and try to get an agent, we just decided we'd publish the book ourselves. And we say, emboldened by our ignorance, we decided to publish ourselves, because there are a lot of differences between publishing software and publishing a book. But we were incredibly lucky. And sometimes luck strikes and you just, you can't do any better. We happened to find a distributor, which is hard to do with one book. And especially a book the wife of the husband who's pushing the book wrote. People go, oh yeah, okay, that's going to be good. But as it happened, the wife of the distributor loved lace and read the Lace Reader and said, you're publishing this book. So that was the first thing that happened. The second was that we hired a public relations company to get us some reviews and get the word out there. And they sent it to Publishers Weekly. And Publishers Weekly did not review self-published books at the time, but we had created an imprint called Flapjacket Press. And we did everything right. We asked our local bookstore and our local library what properties a self-published book should have that they would like to sell. The first was a distributor because you want to be able to have, that's how you order your books. But the second was they wanted it to have a certain look, a certain cover. So we hired a designer, we had hired the public relations company, we hired an editor from New York. When it was submitted, so we really looked like a small press, which was our intention. And our intention also was to then, we expected maybe we could make it a local hit because we have so many tourists coming to Salem. We thought, well, this will be a Salem book, they would probably like that. And we just thought, well, let's see if then we could sell it to a bigger publisher. That would be the ultimate goal. And we had done that with our software company. We had gotten distribution first from Random House and then eventually from Hasbro. So we thought, well, this is the way you do business. So we decided we'd do that. In the meantime, it was submitted to Publishers Weekly and it got a starred review. And we were so ignorant about what that meant that we called and said, what does that mean? And they said, well, it's good. And when that happened, it was like being struck by lightning because the next thing that happened was Hollywood called to offer an option deal. Well, agents from Hollywood called asking if we had representation and all of this. And of course we didn't. And I had been a little burned by Hollywood not wanting me, but also by being there for a while and kind of learning the ins and outs of the screenwriting business. And so I didn't know the agents who were calling, so I called an old friend from my Hollywood days who was a very successful screenwriter and said, do you know this name, this name, this name, any of these people who are calling? And she said, I don't know any of them, but why don't I give it to my agent? So we said, sure. So a few weeks later, the agent from, it was Endeavor, it's now William Morris Endeavor, called and said, we love your book, but who is this small press? We've never heard of them. And she never said it was self-published or they wouldn't have read it. So we said, oh, that's us. And they groaned and said, oh, do you mind if we send it back to New York and get you a bigger publisher? So this is how this whole thing came about. So we went to kind of a bidding war where 5 publishers were bidding and I got to pick who I wanted based on what they said they were going to do for the marketing. So this is, this is amazing luck all around. And kind of, being ready when the luck is ready to strike you, you're ready to take it and work with it. So, so that was from that first book. And then I got a 2-book contract at the time, which has turned into a 4-book contract, but at the time it was 2. And it was supposed to be a 2-week tour. It's kind of like a 3-hour tour, where this is going. It lasted 6 months, and I had a deadline of 2 years for the next book. Now, The Lace Reader had taken me about 7, and I was working the whole time, but it still took a long time. And after the 6-month tour in the US, there was the European tour. And so it was not an easy thing to come up with a book in a year, and I didn't have an idea for it at the time. And my editor said, well, don't leave Salem, we love you in Salem, but write something completely different. So that was how the second book came. And I have to tell you up front that I made the deadline by 45 minutes. And actually, Andre Dubusse, you probably all know Andre, told me to forget deadlines. They don't mean a thing, you don't have to do them. So I was really planning to miss it until my agent said, he's an Oprah pick, you have to hit your deadline. So I'm still mad at him about that. Not really. So the question that came up for the map of true places, I was writing about Salem, but it was really about 10 years later in Salem. And so Salem had been discovered in this odd, when we first moved back there, it had been discovered by witches. And and everything was really big at Halloween, and then turned into a ghost town the day after Halloween. But in the years in between, before the second book, was set, we had been discovered particularly for our real estate, because it's really lovely. We have some old federal houses there that are beautiful, and the prices are a lot less expensive than Boston, and it's on the train line. So people discovered us and started coming, and which was displacing people that had lived there, and it was displacing the Salem witches too, who could no longer afford the shops. And then 9/11 had happened, and as I said, I used to work at the World Trade Center, so this was particularly, it was tough for everyone, and the world changed in that instant, I think. And so the question that came up for the map of true places was, in a world that's changing so fast, what remains constant, and how do you define home and family? Because I think that's changing so much too. I know my mom told me, and I checked this, but she said, it used to be that people never moved more than 50 miles from home. And now, I was on the West Coast, my brother was someplace else, cousins are all over. And so you do start to form different family units. And I know my brother just married a girl from the Dominican Republic, and she has a son that came up. So our family is changing and expanding, and people have been married, brought in-laws in, and it's very interesting to see this extended family that is formed. And so I wanted to write about that. And the image system that came to me for that was celestial navigation, because I think what does remain constant in this quickly changing world, and the stars are constant. Now, in order to write about celestial navigation, the problem was I had to learn it. And even with my addition and subtraction skills, it was a little much for me. So I was studying, and I looked like the crazy lady from Salem to the people in Italy while we were on tour, but I was out on the balcony with a plastic sextant, looking at the stars, trying to figure things out, and I finally figured it out, and yelled, "Yay!" And the people just went, "You're supposed to be, I don't know who you are, get off the balcony. But go home, Miss Berry, go home." But it worked, and I made the deadline by 45 minutes. But one of the things that came into that book was, what do we owe an aging and ailing parent? And I was dealing with this in particular because of my dad and his Parkinson's. And the father in the book has Parkinson's. And it's weird, strangely, I thought I'd be writing a little more about it than I did. But I was right in the middle of his care at the time, and it's all through the book. But it's not faced as directly as I thought it would be. I thought the father was going to be the main character, and I found that too painful to do. So he's a great character. He's one of my favorites, but I've ended up with a different protagonist than I believed. The third book, the one I'm just finishing and I'm going to read to you from, is also in Salem, but something completely different. And again, the years have changed and changed the town again. And I'm going to tell you the 3 questions I asked about Salem, because I actually consider Salem a character in all 3 novels. And so I always ask about characters. I do biographies of each character. And one of the things I ask is, what does a character want and what's keeping them from getting it? And I ask it about everybody, but I also asked it about the city of Salem. And in the first book, The Lace Reader, when I asked what Salem wanted, the answer was forgiveness for the witch trials. 10 years later, where the second book is set, the answer was different. It was, we wanted to redefine our map and be known for something else. So it's a variation of the same thing. But when I asked the same question for the Banshee of Salem, this is a question that prompted the whole book. The answer was forgiveness. And not forgiveness was the first one, was justice. And I thought, okay, that's an interesting take, and that just sort of led me down a very different path. I ended up with a book. The image system in this book is trees, and I'll kind of explain it as I do a little bit of reading. where the trees come from. The question, the ultimate question here that came up was, if you could kill without consequence, would you do it? I mean, that's a pretty heavy question. And then we're talking about justice. And I was trying to explore where am I going with this. And then a subsequent question, and the one that I really base the book on, is when evil things happen, how do you keep from turning evil yourself? So this is a much more serious book in some ways. It also is full of Salem, which is full of humor. So it is lightened by that. The image system here is trees, and what lies beneath. You know, the trees reach skyward, and underneath are the roots, which stretch as far out as the branches generally. And I wanted to explore that image. I'm going to read you a little from it if you'd like to hear it. Okay. Okay. The first is, well, I'll give you a little synopsis. It's about an unsolved murder that happened in Salem in the late 80s, and it's not real. That's a fictional story. But this also harkens back to the witch trials of 1692, and the two are tied together. And that part, of course, is real. It takes place in Salem and in Pride's Crossing. Has anyone ever been to Pride's Crossing? It's a lovely area just over the Beverly Bridge that stretches along the coast, and has a lot of the old mansions from the industrial days out there. For a time, my grandmother rented a house out there, and I fell in love with the area, so I wanted to use it in this book. There's a side trip to Matera, Italy, in the book, but I won't go into that now. But just to stretch the image system, they're looking for, Matera is full of caves that used to be churches where they hid religion, and they had, because they couldn't practice it openly. And this ties to the Salem witch trials as well. But they're trying to restore some of these caves. They have one that we went to called the Crypt of Original Sin, which is fabulous just to visit. But you can see these hundreds and hundreds of churches that have frescoes that have been covered for years. So once again, what lies beneath is part of the image system. So, so I will start by reading a quote. And all of you literary people will know that I can't tell you what it's from. I can only say it's Shakespeare's Scottish play. The name we're not allowed to speak aloud for fear of being struck down. Any theater people here? Okay, well, you're not allowed to say the name of this play because they're so afraid of bad luck. And all sorts of things happen to theatrical productions who use the name, so they call it the Scottish play. I'm starting with a quote from this play that I won't say the name of. There's an old saying, the dead will have their revenge. Gravestones have been known to move and trees to speak to bring guilty men to justice. So that's the quote. And here's the paragraph that just came to me that prompted the entire book. And this is written by a woman named Rose Whalen, who is a homeless person and wasn't always that way, but has kind of lost everything due to the murder that happened years ago that she was blamed for. Never convicted because they really didn't have any evidence, but she's been ostracized in the city ever since. I am a cipher. I carry no weight, no worth, no influence. I represent nothing. I do not exist, or so you believe. My color is black, the opposite of nothing. In the world of color, it is white that is nothing. White pushes all color from itself, taking no responsibility, reflecting all and not absorbing a single thing. Black takes everything in, storing every shade, every affront, until the surface darkens, and looking at me, you cannot see what is right before your eyes. There is a reason that black is the color of night. Black is the color also of the cipher, and the color of the banshee. You turn away when you pass me on the street. You run from me when you should embrace me. But remember this as you flee, you brought me into existence. I'm the cause. I'm not the cause. I'm merely the result. So that was just a little bit of what I call inspiration. But that, you know, that just came to me one night, and I wrote it down. I thought, what the heck is this? where do you go with that? But it turns out that this is a quote, and I say it turns out as if I'm not doing this, but for me, the writing process is a little bit like peeling an onion and discovering a story rather than creating it. This is from Rose's Book of Trees, and Rose believes that the secret to not the murder that happened that she was blamed for, but to the witch trial and executions is known by the trees in Salem, and that the trees talk to her. And of course, Rose has some mental issues that were caused by complex trauma. So that's the beginning of the book. Rose actually believes she's a banshee, and she's Irish. And at one point, there was a legend in Ireland that banshees were diminished goddesses who were trapped in trees. So this is where she has picked up her ideation from. And so I will be reading next about Rose, telling you a little bit about her, if I can find that. Hold on. Okay. This is present day now. Fall had come late this year, but finally it was here. The air chilling and the darkness pervasive. Hurricane Sandy had stolen most of the leaves, but the oaks were being more stubborn and reluctant than usual. Tonight the banshee music was in her ears again, and death was everywhere. She could see it plainly in the pigeons and in the oak leaves that were struggling to hang on to their branches. The leaves looked exhausted. That's the way leaves always look to Rose this time of year, just before they turned the reds and oranges and yellows that drew the tourists to New England. They grew weary before they turned vibrant, having stopped making chlorophyll, the chlorophyll that masked them, but not yet revealing the true colors that lay beneath. The maples, who were always first to turn, were naked now, their webbed branches sweeping the dark sky like witches' brooms, but the oaks were now just beginning to turn. A few days from now, the tourists might be gone, but the oak leaves would look like flames. Tonight, Rose spoke to the tree as she sat down under it, and then she talked to the pigeons, explaining that she was simply going to join them for one night, and that with their permission, she would just set up her camp right over here by the tree. A few shifted, then moved into position around her. She reached down to get her pen. She opened her journal. She had to scribble for a while before the pen would write, but it finally did. All Souls Day, October 31st, 2012, Gallows Hill, oak tree number 11,523. So that's Rose. Rose is actually not one of the protagonists of the story. There are two others, and I'll give you a little bit of background on them. One is John Rafferty, who was chief of police. He's now chief of police, but was one of the protagonists of The Lace Reader. He has moved to Salem from New York after fighting crime for years and getting very burned out there, and is finding Salem to be just as challenging, I think, in a very different way as New York. He's kind of the humor in the book, but he's also a bit of the voice of reason. Sometimes he feels just the opposite. Okay, I will read you his story. Same night. Rafferty had never seen so many trick-or-treaters on Chestnut Street, nor had he ever been charged with escorting such a large witches' march up to Gallows Hill. There were at least 150 of them this year, with Rafferty in his ancient Crown Vic cruiser, blocking the traffic that was already backed up on Highland Avenue as people fought to get into town for the festivities. Salem had been officially dubbed the Halloween capital of the world. Well, no big surprise there. But now Halloween was a month-long celebration, more than a month, truth be told, which was great for the merchants who did most of their business in the fall. That the population of 42,000 grew by at least 300,000 each October was a challenge for Rafferty and his whole police force. Every year they imported extra police from Boston and Lynn and as far away as Connecticut, and each year they were still short-handed. This October he'd been talked into training some academy rookies, creating an intern program. If it worked out, he'd do it again, but he was already having his doubts. He had to watch their every move, and it seemed more trouble than it was worth, especially on a night like this, when Rafferty's presence was needed in every corner of the city, When he'd moved here from New York back in the 90s, it had been a town of witches, pirates, and haunted house tours, seasonal businesses that opened down on the wharf at Halloween and disappeared soon afterward, leaving the place with empty storefronts. Each May, the tour buses began to arrive again, and by midsummer, you couldn't find a parking space anywhere downtown, which was a pain in the ass. But come November 1st, Salem was no longer the witch city, but a ghost town, with storefronts deserted and businesses closed for the winter. You could park anywhere you wanted, but there was nothing to do, which had been fine with Rafferty, who had chosen to relocate to the quotidian seaport because he'd been more than burned out by big city crime fighting, a joke in itself. But in the almost 20 years he'd been here, everything had changed. Salem had been discovered not just as a tourist destination, but as the hot new place to live. You were lucky to get a parking space anywhere in town at any time of year, which is why he still drove the beat-up 1980s Crown Vic, even though he was now chief of police. You could park that old cruiser anywhere. More often than not, some tourist would snap his picture or ask him to pose next to the old-fashioned car with its logo of a flying witch in pointed hat and broomstick on the side. Sometimes he obliged. Usually, he just tried to smile and move on. These days, he was too busy to spend much time making nice with the tourists. It was difficult to tell what started the migration to Salem, but it was growing. No more forgotten seaport, no more aging industrial city. After the real estate boom and the museum came the restaurants, then the nightlife. A bit too much nightlife, Rafferty thought, especially in October. Rafferty was glad he'd bought his fixer-upper in the Willows when he'd first come to town. He couldn't have afforded it these days. He and Towner lived in Washington Square now, in the coach house behind the brick mansion Eva Whitney had left her. And he rented out his oceanfront cottage for more and more money each year, which was great for him, but not so great for the people who wanted to live and work in town, the witches, the pirates, the same people who had put haunted happenings on the map and were responsible for all of the success. He hoped the rising rents wouldn't drive them out. If tonight's parade numbers were any indication, it looked as if he'd been worried for nothing. He'd never seen so many witches making their silent candlelight vigil up Chestnut Street on their way to Gallows Hill. And he'd never seen so many families trick-or-treating at the huge federal mansions that were all decked out for the occasion. Rafferty drove the wrong way up Chestnut Street along the sidewalk to the corner of Flint. "Hey, Rafferty," yelled a pirate known as Worms. "Write yourself a ticket, you're going the wrong way." Each year, the pirate reenactors gathered at the Phillips house to both scare and sing to the children of Salem. "Yeah," his companion Mickey growled. "Arg," Rafferty shouted back at them. "Them's fighting words, John," Mickey said, taking it as invitation to approach the cruiser. "Arg is only one word, Mickey," Rafferty said, "and if you don't know that, you should lay off the dark and stormies. Isn't this supposed to be a kid's party?" Mickey laughed and pounded the cruiser with his fist. "Only way I can stand to be around the little devils." Rafferty turned on his siren and pulled the old Crown Vic ahead of the witches and across Essex Street, blocking incoming cars so they could cross the 4-lane road. As the witches crossed in silent formation, a car in front blared his horn and other drivers joined in a chorus of protest at the delay. It was going to be a long night. So now you know Rafferty. And then I will introduce one more character, and that'll be the end, with 2 little readings. This is the protagonist, the co-protagonist, Callie Cahill, and she is a child of one of the murdered women from back in the 80s. She's quite well adjusted for what she's been through, but she's been raised by nuns in foster care, and now she's a sound healer in a nursing home in Exeter. So she's in New Hampshire. She got away. Okay, so this first little half-page reading comes from the night after the murders happened. It was the nuns from St. James who found her. As the Holy Day Mass ended and the crowds filed out, they could hear her distant cries. It sounded like a trapped animal, some feral dog or cat, racked with pain. The sisters searched the playground and around the foundation of both church and school. Finding nothing, they started back inside the brick schoolhouse when they heard it once again. It was coming from the hill across the street, the sound carrying on wind and over water. It was definitely a child. The little girl stood at the edge of the rocks, blood dripping from her hand. Her eyes were fixed on the spot below where her mother lay. The child would neither move from the edge nor release her grip until the nuns finally pried open her fingers, and the oak rosary dropped to the grass, leaving a scarlet imprint of the 5-petaled rose on her palm. None of the Holy Sisters had ever seen such a thing. It was a perfect red rose, a blood-filled stigmata. The rose was known well to the sisters of their order. Its 5 petals symbolized the 5 wounds of Christ. I think I'm going to stop there. That's probably a good place to end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.